Communism, a political and economic ideology that has shaped the course of history, for better or for worse. While communism has promised equality and the end of class struggles, its implementation around the world has led to significant challenges, suffering, and even catastrophe. Today, we'll explore the darker side of communism's spread and its impact on countries across the globe. Communism emerged as a radical idea during the early 20th century, fueled by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The promise was simple: to abolish private property, dismantle class hierarchies, and create a world where resources were shared equally. However, the reality of communism, especially when it was put into practice by leaders like Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong in China, was far from the utopian vision. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's reign from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953 was marked by widespread repression. The Great Purge, where millions of people were executed or sent to labor camps on mere suspicion of being enemies of the state, left a dark mark on Soviet history. But that was just one side of the story. Meanwhile, in China, Mao Zedong's policies during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution led to widespread famine, mass executions, and cultural destruction. The Great Leap Forward, meant to rapidly industrialize China, caused one of the deadliest famines in history, with an estimated 45 million people perishing. In his quest to eliminate traditional cultural influences, the Cultural Revolution turned the nation upside down, with intellectuals, teachers, and anyone deemed counter-revolutionary becoming targets of violent persecution. The Iron Curtain, a term coined to describe the physical and ideological division between the capitalist West and the communist East, divided Europe for decades. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, became a symbol of the oppression and control that communism had over its citizens. East Germany, under communist rule, suffered from a lack of freedom, surveillance by the Stasi, and economic stagnation, while just across the wall, West Germany thrived. Cuba, a country that embraced communism under Fidel Castro after the 1959 revolution, is another example of communism's darker side. While Castro promised economic prosperity and equality, the reality was far different. Political repression, censorship, and the forced imprisonment of dissenters became commonplace. Cuba's economy, reliant on the Soviet Union, crumbled when the USSR collapsed, leaving the Cuban people facing extreme poverty and isolation. North Korea, perhaps the most extreme example of communist rule in the modern world, remains an isolated dictatorship, with its people living under constant surveillance and facing severe punishment for disobedience. The Kim regime has led the country into a cycle of poverty, human rights abuses, and military dictatorship, all in the name of a communist utopia that remains a distant dream for the North Korean people. In recent years, Venezuela has become another glaring example of the failure of communist principles when applied to modern economies. Under Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela attempted to build a socialist state. However, years of mismanagement, corruption, and a reliance on oil exports have led the country into a severe economic crisis. Hyperinflation, food shortages, and widespread poverty have left millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country in search of a better life. What do all of these examples have in common? They show that while communism promises equality and the elimination of poverty, the reality often involves authoritarian regimes, oppression, and economic failures. The desire to centralize power in the hands of the state has led to a loss of individual freedoms and the rise of totalitarian governments. Many countries that embraced communism have seen their citizens suffer in ways unimaginable. Whether it's through forced labor camps, purges of perceived enemies, famine, or a lack of basic freedoms, communism's promise has often been far removed from its reality. And while some may argue that communism can be a solution in some circumstances, history shows that when power is centralized and dissent is suppressed, the consequences can be disastrous. Today, most of the world has moved away from communism. While some nations still claim allegiance to the ideology, the countries that have embraced democracy and free markets have generally seen better standards of living, greater political freedoms, and economic growth. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the gradual reform of China are testaments to the failure of communist systems in the long run. Communism's spread around the world may have promised a better future for all, but its implementation has left behind a legacy of suffering and oppression. As we reflect on the past, it's important to learn from history so that we can avoid repeating the same mistakes.